By the time the sun was high, the forest had thinned to an expansive meadow that faded forever to the horizon. Rava hadn't realized how much the thick canopy had shaded them from the blazing heat, and sweat gushed from her pores with every step. Every breath she heaved dried her mouth further, and she kept pressing her parched tongue to the roof of her mouth desperately. Rava looked into the cloudless sky.
Elemental gods, wind, please, anything.
As she prayed, she hoped for a breeze, but stillness was the only answer. Dio began coughing. Rava glanced behind her at the black-haired boy, whose hand was to his nose.
Dio?
He waved her away stubbornly. Rava's jaw set. She could tell by his labored breathing that something was off. She saw crimson between his fingers. Rava planted her feet into the tall grass.
Idu, wait.
What? I want to get out of this heat.
Idu turned, the annoyance on his face melting into concern when he saw Dio. He rushed over and brought a hand to Dio's arm. Dio shrugged away, dipping his head low.
Dio, what's going on?
Rava knelt to look at Dio's face and placed the back of her hand on his forehead. Rava couldn't even gasp.
Stop fussing, he's freezing.
What? How?
Oh no.
Dio pushed Rava weakly.
I'm fine.
Blood dribbled from his nose. Rava unclasped her cloak from her back and wrapped it around Dio, her arms supporting him. She looked at Idu. He stood beside Dio and wrapped his arm around his waist. Wind began to pick up. At first, Rava was grateful, then felt her hair stand on end as she realized the wind that blew across the plains was like fire. She felt herself baking, and every moment that passed was a painfully hot one. Lily tugged on Rava's arm.
We have to go. We have to go quickly. We'll burn to death out here.
Lily stepped in front of them and set off down the path, looking over her shoulder every few seconds. Rava and Idu began to take unsteady and awkward steps as Dio tried to keep up with their fast pace. Using her free hand, Rava took Dio's from his nose to wrap his arm around her upper back. He didn't fight this time. His eyes were half closed, and he kept tripping over his own feet as Rava and Idu half dragged him across the fiery meadow.
Dio?
No response. Rava's heart thudded hard in her chest.
Dio, you have to keep talking.
Rava shot a glance at Idu, who kept his gaze forward.
Dio, what's your favorite time of day? Dio, come on. Time of day.
Dawn.
Dio's footing became a bit more sure as he racked his exhausted brain for the answer. Rava looked at Idu with a hopeful smile.
Dio, what about your favorite season?
Season.
Season, Dio.
Spring.
The turbulent winds picked up more as all four of them pushed on, their questions echoing across the burning landscape. Rava felt herself slow and bit her lip, pushing through the searing heat. She struggled to keep up with Idu, who seemed a step ahead of her, his gaze focused on the winding path instead. She looked up and gave an internal groan as she saw the path stretch far across the plains and out of sight. She desperately needed shade. They all did. Rava looked enviously at Lily, who was using her journey staff to propel her along. A fiery gale blasted across Rava's face, making her eyes water. Dio coughed violently. Wind whirled about the three of them. The force of it robbed Rava of her balance, and she grasped onto Dio more tightly, desperate to keep him stable. The winds quickened into a violent swirl, kicking dust into their eyes.
Rava! Edu! Dio!
Lily's scream was drowned out by the burning tornado.
Rava, stop!
What?
Lean down.
Rava began to bend, then felt weight on her back that sucked what little air she had left. Dio's arms were looped around her neck, and she brought up her hands to support him.
Run!
In a confused panic, Rava began to sprint, the air searing her from the inside out. Every step made her want to crumple, but she kept herself going through the mist of dust. The wind battered her to and fro, and she had to run with it to make any progress. Slowly, she saw Lily running at her, still screaming. All at once, the pull of the gale stopped, and Rava rocketed forward, falling to the ground. Dio moaned softly in the smallest of protests.
Rava!
She lifted her head from the dirt at Lily's voice. Lily's hands tugged at her, and Rava tightened her grip on Dio as she slowly got her feet under her.
I'll take him.
Lily shuffled close to Rava as they moved Dio to Lily's back instead. Rava inhaled with relief, then looked behind her. She didn't spot Edu anywhere. Then a shriek came from the sky, and the girls looked up in horror as they saw the blonde-haired boy tumbling over himself in the searing whirlwind.
Edu!
Rava bolted over, but Lily screamed.
Rava, don't! That's not going to help!
She skidded to a stop, looking desperately into the dusted gales. Edu's staff came flying out, landing a few feet away from Rava. She screamed his name again, but got no response. His face came into view briefly, and tears welled up in her eyes as she saw pure fear etched into his features. She brought her staff up, then stopped, remembering Lily's reaction. Rava returned her staff to her back, then looked at Edu's. Her body shook at the thought. She made her way over to it and brought her fingers around the intricately carved wood. Rava's eyes watered as she gripped onto the staff. She shook in pain as it burned, red hot in her fingers. Rava moved her arm up and back, poised to throw the thing to Edu when she next saw him. Energy was sapped from her every moment she waited. Her vision blurred. She blinked away the fire that shook her to the core. Her stance became unsteady. Then, she saw a leg through the whirlwind. She gave a howl that vibrated through the sky and threw the staff like a spear, relieved that it finally left her hand. Rava fell to her knees, her eyes locked on the staff that disappeared into the tornado. The tip of the thing poked out through the swirling wall of dust, leaving empty space behind with every swing. Rava could no longer keep her head up, and she dropped herself to the ground. The winds buffeted her face, then slowed, almost to nothing. She rolled to her back, just in time to see Edu tumble a few feet away into the tall grass beside the path. A surge of energy snapped through her body as she crawled towards him. He was panting heavily, his long blonde hair blown loose from the string that kept it held together. His hands tightly clutched his journey staff, which now was all blackened in the crevices, marked by the burning winds. Rava laid down beside him, the sun much more gentle now than before. Edu began laughing, much to Rava's surprise.
What is it?
It's funny how cruel the heat has been to all of us. And yet, I still love the sun.
The four continued their journey through the meadows of the Vader Path, much more easily now, despite the pains of their fresh wounds and Dio being near dead weight. They kept their pace up, hardly speaking to one another. Only Dio's coughs would spark concerned conversation, which would quickly die out again. Soon enough, the sun was at the horizon, and the air began to cool, soothing their burns. Rava watched Edu fight a yawn, and Lily began to buckle under Dio's weight. Rava wasn't sure how long Lily had been carrying him. Without a word, Rava shifted against Lily's shoulder, and they gently moved Dio over to Rava's back. Rava put her hand to his head. He wasn't nearly as sweaty or chilly as before. A gentle breath heaved from her as she pressed her own head to his for a moment. More than anything, she wanted him to get better. A silent prayer filled her as they continued in the twilight. Rava quickened her pace to keep in step with Lily and Edu, as painful as it was. He was running his fingers along his scorched staff, his brow furrowed.
You okay?
I'm worried about it.
Guilt clawed at Rava's throat.
I'm sorry I threw it. It was all I could think of.
I'm not mad. It probably saved my life, in all honesty.
She lifted her palm to her blue eyes, wincing at the blisters already forming. Edu raked a hand through his hair.
I just don't know if it's broken, I guess. I mean, what am I supposed to do if it doesn't work?
Do you really think they can break?
Lily gripped onto her golden staff tightly. Rava rolled her eyes and pushed her finger against Edu's journey staff. Pain shot through her finger, and she quickly moved away.
Still works.
Well, that was dumb.
Yeah, but now we know.
He shook his head and laughed. Lily yawned.
Are either of you tired?
Yes.
Shouldn't we stop for the night?
Rava looked out to the meadow, which was now slowly coming to life with fireflies. It made her stop in her tracks, and the others followed suit, enjoying the dancing lights in the dimming sky.
I used to think they were fairies.
The girls looked at Edu. His brown eyes sparkled with the storyteller's light, and instantly Rava was engaged.
When I was little, Dio would know. I would race into the forests of our valley in Gyala, once the sun said goodbye for the day. I used to run with the lights, and they always followed me. We chased each other round and round in circles, so I thought they must be fairies. I even heard them whisper to me a few times.
You did?
Mm-hmm. I did.
What do they say?
I never could understand it, but it was always a song. That's why I love to hum. I never quite recall it, but I feel I'm closer every day.
Maybe the Ancient One spoke to you.
I doubt the elemental gods would come talk to a little boy every night. That's not a tale I would claim.
But maybe.
Maybe.
He gave a sly grin to Rava and pinched her nose. Edu winked and straightened his cloak.
Let's go.
We're not resting?
We just did. And we need to get Dio to the druids. At this point, he's not even responsive.
Rava and Lily looked to each other, worry clear on their faces. Edu poked Rava's cheek and took Lily's hand, starting up his fairy song. It was upbeat and light, unlike the night before, and it invigorated Rava. The three of them continued along the path, pushing forth to the trees in the far distance.
Don't worry, Dio. We'll make it. You'll make it.
When the group had reached the trees, the sky was black, and every star had blinked into view. The trees here were bare, and the ground crunched with frost underfoot. Rava fought a shiver and tightened her gray cloak over Dio. She put her hand to his head again. Dio gave a tiny squeak in protest as she gave a start at his burning forehead. She felt an arm against her side as Lily huddled close for warmth. The swollen moon illuminated their chilled breath as Lily spoke through chattering teeth.
How is he?
Not good. He feels like he's ablaze now.
God.
Lily looked up into the night.
I prayed these trees would provide us shelter for the night.
Don't give up yet. We can find something.
Rava's shoulders creaked uncomfortably, and she tried to tilt her body slowly, as to not wake up Dio.
Hey, Idu.
He looked back at the girls, his tall silhouette stark against the moonlight.
Can you take him?
Idu bent, with his arms behind him, and they draped Dio over his back, careful not to let him touch Idu's staff.
I'm gonna scout ahead.
I'm going too.
No, Idu can't fight with Dio on his back if something happens.
Lily opened her mouth to argue, and then thought better of it. Rava turned and took off along the path, the air that once burned in her chest now freezing her lungs with every inhale. The path that snapped with each step slowly turned into solid rock under her tired feet, and the pain in her leg surged. She shook her head at how dizzying it was. It had taken Rava all of her mental strength to continue on ignoring her leg, but she simply couldn't anymore. She limped heavily through the winding trail and felt the mist thicken around her into the smallest of raindrops. Rava's breath heaved in clouds as she pushed through the dull agony and biting cold.
Gods, please, let this be over soon.
At her internal plea, the sky cracked with thunder, and rain began to roll into the tundra. Tears mixed with raindrops as she took out her journey staff to support her against the winds. As she stood there, gripping her staff, she began to scream. Rava was livid. Livid at the pain, livid at the cold, livid at the gods and herself for her foolish actions. She heard howls in the distance behind her, but she kept walking. Her fury fueled her, and she was determined to find some form of shelter for them all.
Another step. Another step.
She grit her teeth and planted her feet into the ground, one after the other. The rain grew icy and cut across her face angrily. Rava's fingers lost feeling, and she heard her staff clatter to the frozen ground. Before she realized it, she tumbled to the icy rock, hail pummeling onto her back, as howls carried across the wind.